Hey folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. So let's talk about the major event that brings the year 2020 to a close, a year that has seen such a rapid shifting of collective reality. So the whole globe has been subject to forces and events that have affected everyone, events that have had deep, fundamental, structural implications for humankind and the way that we interact with each other. So whether we live in Europe or Australia or America or Africa or wherever, despite the disparate locations across the globe, we've all been subject to sweeping forces which have really put into sharp perspective what affects humanity as a whole, the things that affect humanity as a whole. And as we contemplate Aquarius, we understand that Aquarius as a sign principle itself calls our attention to what is going on at the broadest or macro levels of our collective social organization. So when we're talking about the things that affect humankind as a collective entity, we are in Aquarius's domain, the systems and structures that affect humankind as a collective entity. And so Aquarius is an air sign, calling our attention to the systems of thought that affect society as a whole, the conceptual basis on which we organize society. So the ideas that go into how we think about society as a whole. So we would understand, for example, things like law and political thought as Aquarian things, insofar as law and political thought have to do with the fundamental concepts and ideas that organize society. The preceding sign, Capricorn, is also about the organization of society, but much more in practical, concrete terms. So Capricorn would be the enforcer of the rules and laws that govern society. So Capricorn says, here are the rules and here are the consequences if you break them. Capricorn says, well, you stop at a stop sign or at a red light, and if you don't, here are the consequences. And Aquarius says, well, let's think about the concepts that give rise to these rules. Let's see if we need to push the bounds of our thinking and generate new ideas that in turn give rise to new practical structures and systems. So keep that phrase in mind, pushing the bounds or going beyond the boundary. It's something that we will refer back to. So yes, Aquarius is meant to introduce or seed the new systems of thought that would push us beyond the bounds or limits of the old Capricorn order. So in 2020, we've seen in a very short space of time, we've seen the breakdown of the old order of things, of course, portended by Saturn joining up with Pluto in Capricorn. The old rules of order and organization, Saturn Capricorn, have been subject to breakdown, Pluto. So at the end of 2020, we find ourselves in a very different reality than we had at the beginning of the year. The old order of things is clearly on its way out, and we find ourselves in the place of trying to figure out, well, what's going to take its place? So in the wake of the breakdown of things, well, I'm no longer working in the same way I used to. My kids aren't attending school in the same way. We're all trying to wrap our minds around what's going to be the new system that takes the place of the old. In the immediate wake of COVID, we were contemplating how soon we could return to normal, in quotes, and now many of us are realizing that we are in a new collective normal. So 2 weeks to slow the spread has become, well, 8 months or 9 months of negotiating a very new terrain which has broken down the usual ways of doing things. So 8 or 9 months of trying to negotiate a new normal. And also psychically adjusting to the idea that, well, in some ways we're going to have to kiss the old goodbye. So Saturn in Aquarius, building or constructing that Saturn, a new society, Aquarius. Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius, the rollout and expansion and construction of a new society and the new ideas and new concepts that underpin this new society. So a new 20-year synodic cycle of Jupiter and Saturn is being initiated, taking place at 0 degrees of Aquarius, the very first degree of the sign. So doubly emphasizing the idea of a fresh start, something new. So conjunctions are, of course, seed points, beginning points, and we have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction taking place at 0 degrees of Aquarius, like we said, the very beginning of the sign. So this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction really marks the very beginning of a rollout of new social organization that affects humankind as a whole. The beginning of a new 20-year cycle, which is fundamentally about rolling out new systems of social organization that are beyond the boundaries of what has been established, what we've been traditionally accustomed to. So let's look at what we have going on. Saturn settles down into Aquarius on December 17, 2020, and then Jupiter enters Aquarius 2 days later on December 19. Then we have Jupiter and Saturn joining up at 0 degrees Aquarius on the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its furthest point below the equator, the darkest day of the year, with the least amount of light. So the sun enters Capricorn. So the beginning of the time when animals hibernate, a time when it's about retraction and contraction, drawing of the energy inward, a retraction of energy back into the seed. So the sun symbolically dies and initiates a process of rebirth. So the winter solstice would initiate a time of gestation. So beneath the stark coldness and stillness of the winter, there are powerful forces of renewal which are germinating silently. So there are few visible signs of life on the surface, yet below ground there is a powerful renewal taking place. So a withdrawal, retraction, retreat of consciousness inward to begin the process of seeding something new. So we're having this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at an extremely energetically significant point, a point which doubly emphasizes this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction as simultaneously a death point and the beginning of a point of rebirth where powerful renewing forces are being seeded beneath the surface decay. And so, as we were mentioning in the beginning, we have to understand this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, the movement of Jupiter and Saturn into Aquarius and occupying these signs. We have to understand this in the context of Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto in Capricorn. This fusion of energies that has been the hallmark of 2020. So Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto all together stimulating the sign field of Capricorn has meant in broad terms the wholesale breakdown of the established order. Jupiter and Saturn migrating into Aquarius and beginning a new synodic cycle at 0 degrees of the sign fundamentally cues us into the new order that is birthed from the breakdown of the old. So the new order socially that is birthed out of the breakdown of the old. Now, in terms of dates, Jupiter is in Aquarius throughout 2021, and we have a bit of an interlude when Jupiter dips into Pisces in May, June, and July, but we'll talk more about that in other videos on the channel. But basically, Jupiter is in Aquarius throughout 21, and we have Saturn in Aquarius until 2023. So as Jupiter and Saturn work within the Aquarius sign field, we still have Pluto. We still have Pluto there wrapping up the final degrees of Capricorn. So we're very much still negotiating this dynamic between the breakdown, Pluto, of the old order, Capricorn, the social order and its accompanying institutions and values, the breakdown of that, and the formation and rollout of the new social order, Jupiter, Saturn in Aquarius. So we're still in this sort of frictional negotiation process. So aspects of tradition and what has been established breaking down for better and for worse. That's the thing with Capricorn Aquarius. It's, well, what of the old do we keep? The shift from Capricorn into Aquarius will raise the question of, well, what of the old do we keep? So futuristic Aquarius, colored by an expansive, forward-moving Jupiter, that may say, well, to hell with the old. Let's just keep on pushing the boundary with the new. So any shift from Capricorn to Aquarius involves this frictional negotiation between what of the old we must keep. And of course, the caution is, well, the caution is against throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And this is a central dynamic of the expanding, forward-reaching impulse of Jupiter in Aquarius and Saturn, on the other hand, which on one level is about the preservation of the old, or to use another word, conserving the old for its value and practical utility. So in that way, on one level, Saturn is fundamentally conservative in that it wants to conserve. So just by contemplating Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius, the fact that they are together in the sign already puts on the table this archetypal tension inherent with Jupiter and Saturn. So pushing forward beyond the limits, Jupiter, and conserving Saturn, what has been established, Saturn. And we have this taking place in the sign domain of Aquarius, which has to do with, as we said, collective society, collective human structures of relating. So what boundaries are we going to push in terms of how we think about being human and organizing society? And what of the old standards do we need to conserve? What standards do we conserve to let those stay right where they are because they're good and valuable and useful and practical? All right, so let's dive down now into getting more of a handle on the specific themes, lessons, and dynamics of Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius and the initiation of the new synodic cycle with their conjunction and the dynamics that we have from them simply being together in the same sign. So, Jupiter in Aquarius, let's give that a tagline. The swelling of the revolutionary spirit, the swelling of a spirit which says, I'm not really acquiescing to the rules. As we've been talking about on the channel, one of the hallmarks of 2020 with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions and this general fusion of Jupiter-Pluto-Saturn, as they've been dancing in this triple conjunction, one of the hallmarks of the year has been top-down, wholesale directives from people and institutions in power. So wholesale, Jupiter, control, Saturn, Pluto, of many spheres of our existence. So we've seen this in the wake of COVID. Here is what you can do. Here is what you're allowed to do. Here is when you can go out or do your shopping or exercise. You're not allowed to have your business open. Here are the rules for Thanksgiving. So whatever you think of the measures where you live, the point is that 2020 has resulted in this encroachment of authority into spheres of our collective existence that is unprecedented in recent times, certainly. This has gone along with, as is very characteristic of Capricorn, it's gone along with a sort of paternalism. So we are the experts. We know what's best. We're going to shield you from what has been termed harmful misinformation. So tech companies who have now become part of the Capricornian machinery of institutional power saying, well, we're taking it upon ourselves to make sure you don't really see certain data because we're concerned for your exposure to harmful misinformation. So 2020 has come along with more encroachment of authority into spheres of our lives that we have not seen in recent times, like we said. It's come with that, along with the amplification, Jupiter, and intensification, Pluto, of a certain kind of paternalism, Capricorn. And with Jupiter in Capricorn during this last year, fusing its energy with Saturn and Pluto, what we've seen is the amplification and intensification of a basic Saturn Capricorn principle. Constraint. Here are the rules you have to abide by. Again, whatever your personal opinion of the constraints on personal freedoms, the constraint that has been the hallmark of 2020, the basic fact is that 2020 has come with a rollout of a whole host of constraints that we've not really quite seen before. So as we have the astrological heavies of Jupiter and Saturn shifting from Capricorn to Aquarius, we have this dynamic between constraint, Capricorn, and freedom from constraint, and the defense of personal freedom that is so characteristic of Aquarius. So where were we? We were talking about the swelling of the revolutionary spirit. Jupiter in Aquarius, the swelling up of a spirit which wants freedom from Capricornian constraints. So with Jupiter and Saturn jointly together in Aquarius, we can see a specific sort of dynamic shaping up. The swelling, Jupiter, of the revolutionary spirit, Aquarius, the spirit which wants freedom from constraint, meeting the forces which will try to control and manage, that Saturn, control and manage this revolutionary rule-breaking spirit and try to have it submit to authority and control. So the swelling of the revolutionary spirit and this going up against those who would try to control it. Saturn. So the Saturnian impulse to exercise authority and control. So Jupiter in Aquarius will symbolically describe those who would go outside the bounds of thought or the thinking which is endorsed by various authorities and experts and institutions in power, Capricorn. Again, this Aquarian value, going beyond the bounds. Saturn, forces which would try to constrain, control, and contain those who are going beyond the bounds. Attempts to quell and control, that Saturn, the swelling or growing revolutionary outside the bounds spirit. And so Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius, on another level of its joint symbolism, would also represent those who would dare to begin to develop, to roll out alternative structures that facilitate a new way of doing things, especially a new way of doing things that is less bound by establishment thinking or establishment control. So Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius on one level would represent the building out of the infrastructure that is meant to be a counter to what has become the old establishment. And the Jupiter Saturn conjunction point at the energetic gateway of the solstice on deeper levels represents a seed point from which, let's say, capsules of awareness become dispersed or distributed throughout the collective. So capsules of awareness that, when opened, distribute the thought forms and the ideas which various kinds of people will use to help build these alternative structures. So structures and systems which are at their core about the ultimate freedom of humankind, and systems which support, let's say, the dignity of being human. So the solstice point is an important gateway of energy that has to do with the seeding and distribution of certain thought forms which contain, in, let's say, capsule form, the new ideas that will challenge the status quo. And in terms of seeing the rollout of alternative structures and systems as a counter to the establishment, this is something that we will see especially in tech. So within tech, within the next few years and within this 20-year cycle, this new 20-year cycle initiated by a conjunction in Aquarius, let's say there will be a sort of divide between companies who've become part of the Capricorn establishment and those smaller firms which will represent a sort of breakaway from the establishment. So the emergence of smaller tech firms that would, let's say, break up some of the hold of the more hegemonic sort of monolithic tech giants. So beginning to build out the structures that dismantle some of the hold of these hegemonic tech giants. So the emergence and strengthening of more, let's say, grassroots alt tech companies who will find alternative ways of financing themselves and alternative technologies which will compete against the tech establishment. So the building up of new systems to counter the Capricorn establishment, especially within tech, is going to be colored by or informed by another central Aquarian value, the defense and preservation of personal freedom and autonomy. So it's not just about developing new apps or new whatever. Many people are going to be doing this out of an ethic which says, I need to make or find viable alternatives which allow me to preserve my freedom and autonomy, especially when it comes to information and data, the information and data that is available to me. So imagine, if you would, the internet as a great big battleground of different types of consciousness. So the internet is a space which is an outpicturing of the collective mind, the terrain of the collective consciousness, and the different subgroups of consciousness within the collective. So different families of consciousness, so to speak, vying and contesting. So Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius will herald the build out of alternative spaces, especially in terms of what information you can access where, what data you can access where. Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius will herald more of a building out of spaces on the internet which facilitate access to information not readily available from mainstream or establishment sources. And these spaces will be, let's say, meeting grounds for the families of consciousness which are more interested in pushing the bounds of consensus or mass thought. These kinds of people will be building out more spaces on the internet. And this brings us to another key dynamic of Jupiter in Aquarius. More people within the collective daring to explore systems of thought and ideas which are outside the bounds of what is traditionally taught. So expanding their picture of reality, Jupiter, to go beyond the bounds, Aquarius, beyond the bounds of what has been established. So Jupiter is at once the principle of expansion and also represents our interpretive framework of reality, the beliefs we hold about reality. So Jupiter, with this Aquarian flavor, will support this expansion of mind to entertain ideas way beyond the bounds, and to some degree, let us say that humanity will undergo an initiation into the strange. Lots of people will have their beliefs rattled by things that seem a bit out there, strange, but we have this on the heels of Jupiter conjunct Pluto in Capricorn, which was a sort of evolutionary invitation to overhaul, that's Pluto, to transform some of our established beliefs, Jupiter, about reality and what is possible within reality. So Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius, things that expand Jupiter, the bounds or limits Saturn of mass thinking, Aquarius. As we said, under Aquarius's domain is the collective mind, collective systems of thought. So Jupiter in Aquarius will portend a foray into things which, as we said, appear to be far out. So humanity will be faced with the evolutionary task of adjusting to data and information which challenges the parameters of collective thinking. And we can look at this in the context of the Jupiter-Uranus square at the beginning of next year, 2021. So it's a short-lived square, but regardless, a significant energy gateway of sorts that will usher in 2021. So this idea of the frictional process square that involves adjusting our interpretive frameworks, Jupiter, adjusting them to what seems far out, Uranus. So this is a collective process. The shaking up, that's Uranus, of people's beliefs, Jupiter, by things which seem far out. So Jupiter in Aquarius, the Jupiter-Uranus square, and the initiation of a new synodic cycle of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius would support a leap-off point, a point of initiation into a paradigm which incorporates more of the strange, and a paradigm that would incorporate more of the unusual, more of the things that we've been historically afraid to talk about or think about, especially to do with off-planet activity as well as the existence of certain technologies. So we can find scenarios where ideas that seemed too weird before, well, we'll see their validity in more concrete terms. Again, this will test the collective perception and mind. So it's almost like the skull, and Saturn would govern the skeletal structure. So the skull would have to grow, Jupiter, to accommodate the expansion, again Jupiter, the expansion of these new ideas which test the bounds of reality as we know it. Aquarius, beyond the bounds. So humanity is readying itself to leap beyond the limits of its awareness, but it will be a frictional journey of allowing what is out there to become incorporated more into the structure of collective belief systems. So Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius, the building of new limits of collective awareness to embrace what has not been traditionally understood to be normal. So pushing the fence out by a few meters in terms of what is now admissible to the human collective awareness. Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius would support the rollout of a tremendous amount of individual ingenuity. So individual ingenuity that would bypass the traditional structures and rule. The idea of going around the system again for better and for worse. So finding ways to bypass the rules and constraints of establishment power. So it would describe this idea of outsmarting those in charge. So agile, nimble, independent, free thinkers who outsmart elements of establishment power and who are basically invested in preserving human autonomy and freedom in the face of those who would undermine it for, let's say, more nefarious or underhanded purposes. So this will be a major battleground, especially in the context of the Saturn-Uranus squares of 2021. So let's segue into that a bit. So we have Saturn in Aquarius squaring up with Uranus in Taurus throughout 2021. This is a central dynamic of the astrology of 21 throughout the whole year. But in terms of when the squares perfect, when they become exact, we have exact Saturn-Uranus squares in February, June, and December of 2021. So the Saturn-Uranus ongoing square throughout next year will amplify tensions between those who want freedom from constraints, the rule breakers, people with a willingness to defy authority, and the experts and the forces that would want to contain them, to contain these rule breakers. So the archetypal clash between the Saturn archetype, well, here are the rules, here is what you're supposed to do, and then those who say, well, to hell with the rules. And those people, of course, would be symbolically represented by Uranus. So the Saturn-Uranus squares of next year, 21, will throw into sharp contrast those who are more amenable to being told what to do by various authorities and experts, Saturn, and those who are not so amenable to being told what to do, Uranus, the rebels. So the Saturn-Uranus squares of next year will throw into sharp perspective those in the collective who are more fearful on the negative side or more prudent on the positive side in terms of the preservation of their security, and those whose need for freedom and the defense of liberty will trump any fears they have. So The Uranian voice in the collective will say, I don't care about the consequences, the punishment from various authorities and agents of the state. I must break the rules to defend my liberty and to defend myself from the encroachment of authority onto my freedoms. This is the very rebellious Uranus. So these people will be very different from those in the collective who would be more unwilling to challenge authority, different from those who would defy authority. And so what's important to appreciate is that the frictional tension between these groups, between these two groups, between these two qualities of consciousness, that will create altogether new social dynamics and a reorganizing of society, a restructuring and reordering of interaction. So it's going to get extremely tense in this respect because the Saturnian people and the Uranian people have fundamentally conflicting ideas that go to the heart of how they see the world and themselves within the world. So Saturn in Aquarius, a restructuring of society, which has to do with the tension generated by this frictional exchange between the Saturnian and Uranian states of consciousness in the collective. So how do people who have such radically different approaches to living, how do they coexist? How do those who are more amenable to being told what to do by the experts, how do they coexist with those who are not so amenable to that? What social dynamics arise from this? How might society organize itself along those lines? What does that look like? So those are the questions. So the Saturn-Uranus squares of 2021, or the Saturn-Uranus ongoing square, which lasts throughout the year, will also support the building out of new structures, new social structures, new methods of social organization. But also, it's an interchange of energy that supports the development and push for alternative methods of doing things in various industries, technology, pharma, medicine, etc. All right, so let's talk about a few other themes here as we contemplate Jupiter and Saturn entering Aquarius and the initiation of a new synodic cycle between the two planets in the sign. So one of the things that we want to be alert to in the Saturn in Aquarius years, as well as throughout this new Jupiter-Saturn synodic cycle, we want to be aware of this idea of having to face up to confront the realities in terms of our relationship with tech, the consequences of tech for humanity, this becoming more apparent now as the major tech explosion of the 90s, the emergence of the internet or the World Wide Web in the early 90s experiences its first Saturn return. So Saturn coming back to Aquarius now. So the World Wide Web is having its Saturn return. So this idea of facing our relationship with tech, with web-enabled devices, facing more of the consequences of web-enabled wireless devices, etc., the psychological, psychic, physical effects of the intrusion of the internet onto human life. So we're going to be facing some more of the stark realities of the effects of wireless frequencies and how they interact with the human body and mind at individual and collective levels. Now again, one of the things that we've been saying is that Aquarius as a sign domain puts on the table the idea of the macro systems and structures that affect humanity as a whole. So Aquarius puts on the table the idea of the collective at the broadest levels, the human collective as a whole entity. So in 2020, as Saturn dipped into the very first degrees of Aquarius, well, we've been facing a global pandemic, if you haven't noticed. So wherever we are in the world, whatever nationality, race, political affiliation. We've all been affected by a single mass event on a scale and with such immediacy that we've not seen on the planet in recent times. So the idea of the whole of humanity, extremely large portions of the globe, billions of people, simultaneously responding to and dealing with an event. And so as Saturn moves into Aquarius, and as we have the initiation of a new Jupiter Saturn synodic cycle in Aquarius, one of the central things to appreciate is that we are moving into an expanded consciousness of being a collective humanity. And we mean this without attaching any sort of value or ethical connotation. So meaning humanity is now in the phase of developing a heightened consciousness of its existence as a collective entity. This doesn't necessarily go along with any values of unity or togetherness. It just means that we are moving into more of an awareness of the fact that we are existing as a collective species. So within the Saturn in Aquarius years and within the 20-year Jupiter Saturn cycle being initiated in Aquarius, we are moving into more experiences of mass events, meaning regardless of your location on the globe, you are going to be involved in or sharing in an experience which affects larger and larger portions of humanity. And this is, let's say, a necessary evolutionary phase or point for the planet, for humanity, because sharing in collective experiences or global mass events is going to go hand in hand with the development of more of, how should we describe this? The development of more of a collective mental infrastructure. So meaning the human being's spiritual anatomy or non-physical psychic anatomy is developing in a way where we're going to be, let's say, downloading a mental infrastructure that has to do with the way in which we as individuals are plugged into the collective consciousness. So we could describe it as the development or rollout of another portion of the human spiritual anatomy that allows us to perceive and understand the relationship between the individual consciousness and the group consciousness. So another portion of the human anatomy coming online, no pun intended, so coming online in a greater way, which is designed for us to appreciate that we are each plugged into a collective consciousness, a human collective consciousness body. And so let's see if we can draw a kind of analogy here. So as the individual human being matures physically, that goes along with a series of energetic changes which have a physical component, such as the release of certain hormones. And we see this, of course, at puberty. Now, if we imagine the collective consciousness as a body, we are moving into a phase of maturation which goes along with its own energetic changes. A change to the collective body which involves strengthening or establishing more of the link between the individual consciousness and the collective consciousness. So the neural link that establishes a connection between the individual and the collective, the energetic system or pathway by which messages travel from the individual consciousness to the collective and vice versa. And this is something that is taking place more on the mental level, the collective mental body. And that is what falls under Aquarius's domain, the collective thought matrix. Aquarius being, of course, an air sign to do with thought, collective thought. So just as how an individual would have a mental body, an emotional body as parts of one interconnected system, this mirrors the structure at the collective level. So what applies at the level of the smaller unit, the individual, applies at the level of the bigger unit, the collective. And so it's going to mean also that humanity is developing more of an ability to intentionally affect the collective direction by individual focusing of thought. So as individuals establish more of this energetic link into the collective at the mental level, it's ushering in more of the ability to focus the collective mind. And so we're in the very incipient beginning stages of bringing more of this part of our nature into active functionality. And this ability to intentionally focus the collective mind is, let's say, a prerequisite for what is to come in later years as we face up to more of the realities of what exists off planet, and as humanity as a whole interacts with what is beyond the realm of our planet. So establishing this collective mental infrastructure and the individual ability to connect into it is a prerequisite for dealing with what lies beyond the realm of our planet in terms of humanity establishing a relationship with with more of what lies beyond Earth. So a bit of a segue there into some broader considerations. Now, in the wake of COVID, we've seen in a very short space of time some fundamental changes to social norms, or let's say human norms. The idea of so-called social distancing. Social distancing would get to the heart of what it means to be human, meaning it puts on the table what being human is, because as human beings we are social creatures. So social distancing is, let's say, on one level an interruption of a basic human impulse, an interruption of the usual frameworks of human interaction, an interruption of some of the basic sense of what it means to be human. We've been told to social distance, and that isn't a norm. So the Saturn in Aquarius years until 2023 and the initiation of this new Jupiter Saturn 20-year cycle is going to go along with negotiating a new set of norms that govern human interaction. And the word negotiate, I'm using that quite deliberately and intentionally here, because we will not be entirely in agreement on what these new norms will be or should be. Meaning there are those in the collective who will hold on to some of the more traditional understandings of basic human interaction and norms. And then there are those who will be altogether more invested in new norms that have to do especially with the increasing encroachment of the internet into more and more facets of life. So there will be those who will be more invested in developing norms which have to do with blending more of the biological and the technological. But in general terms, as we've seen in the wake of COVID, for better and for worse, in general terms, the Saturn in Aquarius years, and with Jupiter and Saturn both activating the Aquarius sign field, this will go along with the internet being relied on more than ever. So places where the internet and tech did not previously intrude will now be intruded upon. So Jupiter's expanding influence, expanding the reach of tech. So there is a reorganization of human social norms underway with this Jupiter-Saturn confluence of energies in Aquarius, and with a new cycle between the two planets beginning in the sign. So the conjunction will also be the seed point of the rolling out of some very unusual, strange, and experimental technologies. Expanding Jupiter beyond the bounds, Saturn, beyond the bounds of what has been established in terms of certain innovations, so new science. The next few years will also see us collectively dealing with the question of whether certain scientific and technological innovations are ethical or not. And these ethical questions will revolve around what it means to be human, meaning what is permissible along the spectrum of what is human. So we will be confronting as a collective scientific and technological innovations that want to push the bounds of what being human is. So questions having to do with the responsible and ethical use of technology, using it with integrity and maturity and responsibility. So with Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius and the beginning of this new cycle between them, what we are confronting is the reconfiguring of all definitions of what it means to be human. There is, with all this, a venturing out into, let's say, new experiments of what it means to be human, especially around continually shifting ideas of how we come to the question of gender and biological sex. And this will be a very contested playground in the years to come, where we will be playing out conflicting ideas as the bounds of the old norms here are pushed. So differences in opinion regarding the definitions of biological sex will deepen splits in the collective. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction point in Aquarius and the new cycle between them, beginning in the sign, will raise some central questions. One is, well, who is in the group? And what are we now accepting into our idea of what being human is? What spectrum of expression and behaviors do we accept into our idea of humanity and what being human is all about? What expressions of gender and sex do we admit or allow into the spectrum of being human? As we said, this will be a biggie. So the question is, in the next few years, what philosophy of society, Jupiter in Aquarius, what philosophy of society are we going to construct, Saturn? Are we going to build? Jupiter, along with its home sign, Sagittarius, has to do with our fundamental philosophical assumptions and ideas. So Jupiter in Aquarius, the philosophy of society. So what new social thought are we going to need to meet the shifting face of what it means to be human in the modern age? So these are the questions. But to return to what we were discussing before, this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction point and the new cycle in Aquarius, beginning there, is an important energetic point. So eras on the planet have their own location, so to speak, within time. So specific ages on the planet have their own locations within time. And astrology, being a study of the cycles of time, lets us know that we deal with certain issues and themes again and again. The cycles repeat themselves. And so certain time periods or eras have a specific energetic location and quality to them. And time points or time locations where we're dealing with similar issues have a similar energy quality. So let's see if we can find another analogy here. So you have different countries in Europe, yes? And they each have their own distinct characteristics. As anyone who's traveled to Europe will know, Germany is different from Spain, Spain is different from France, and France is quite different from Italy. So yet still, as locations in Europe, they still share a fundamental Europeanness, a certain quality that makes them somewhat similar. So this not only applies to physical locations, but to periods of time. So certain time points and coordinates in time will have similarities and share a similar energy or energy signature, and they're linked together because they have these similarities. So this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction point and the ensuing 20-year cycle that follows would also connect into time coordinates where humanity would have had to face consequences and lessons, Saturn, in terms of its approach to technology and science, Aquarian domains. So many of the lessons would have had to do with understanding the body as an organic technology, an organic, let's say, biological computer, versus replacing organic human consciousness with experiments whose ethics are questionable insofar as they undermine the sanctity of being human. So undermining the sanctity and sacredness of the natural human template of consciousness by technological means. So repeating certain lessons there. On other levels, as we head into Jupiter in Aquarius and also in the Saturn in Aquarius years, which would extend a couple of years longer than Jupiter being in the sign, one of the things we can expect to see more of is identity politics. A political approach to vying for rights and privileges where people of a particular social background or class or race or sexual orientation or gender or whatever other identifying factor, where they develop political agendas and organize based on the idea of oppression. So I have this identity, and because of it, I experience oppression, and on that basis, I'm going to organize politically to claim rights and privileges. And no doubt we will see many of these Aquarius dramas play out in the USA context, where Saturn and Jupiter will join up with the USA South Node in Aquarius. So the USA dealing with its past and dealing with the philosophical underpinnings of its society. Now, let's say a brief word in terms of people who are going to be having their Saturn returns in Aquarius. Well, more so their first Saturn return. So we're looking at those born in the early 90s, 91 to the beginning of 94. So they're now reaching a maturation peak, the return of Saturn to where it was when they were born in Aquarius. And so many of them are now coming into playing their roles in terms of building the new infrastructure for a new consciousness on the planet and contributing to the reorganization of society and restructuring again, as we said, some of the conceptual and philosophical foundations of society and what it means to be human. So some will do this for better and some will do it for worse. And this generation would also have Uranus in Capricorn. So Uranus in Capricorn and Saturn in Aquarius in what we call mutual reception in astrology. So each planet in the sign that the other planet rules. So using modern rulerships, Uranus would govern Aquarius, and we find Uranus in Capricorn, Saturn's sign. So Saturn in Aquarius in Uranus's sign as well. So these are the people who, in broad terms, have the imprint of dismantling, that's Uranus, dismantling some of what has been established, Capricorn, and then in turn, building or constructing, Saturn, a new social order, Aquarius, a new social order in its place. But they will be important, these people will be important in terms of what they contribute to changing some of the conceptual framework of how we come to society and the question of being human, especially in the age of tech. So they are having their Saturn returns at the same time that the World Wide Web is having its first Saturn return. All right, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius at more personal psychological levels. So Jupiter in Aquarius, the opportunities that come from cultivating independence of mind and autonomy of thought. So those Aquarian values. So where in my life do I need to have the courage to be independent in my thinking, perhaps to go beyond the bounds of what has been established? And this would get to the heart of the shift of these astrological heavies, Jupiter and Saturn, into Aquarius. So this gets to the heart of what happens when Jupiter and Saturn shift from Capricorn into Aquarius. This idea of constraint, as we said, Capricorn, and freedom from constraint, Aquarius. So where do I need to break free from certain constraints? Freedom to think for myself, where thinking for yourself and being autonomous has a sort of emancipatory value. So Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius, as it triggers parts of the natal chart, planets and houses and angles and points, It would speak to where you may need to move beyond the bounds in your own life, to move beyond what has become restrictive, to not be afraid to break with convention. So it would speak to the opportunities that come from going in the direction of thinking for yourself or independently clarifying your own values. Freeing yourself from constraints, self-imposed and otherwise. So working that Saturn to cultivate these sorts of Aquarian values and approaches. So let's apply this lens to the houses of the chart to see what we get. So if Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius are transiting the first house, then perhaps you might think about taking risks, Jupiter, in your self-expression, which have to do with freedom from what is restrictive and which have to do with not being afraid to be different. So building that Saturn more of a foundation for your identity, which might be based on your willingness to depart from what is traditional or established. So expansion and strengthening or buttressing of your self-expression based on your willingness to go beyond the bounds, to embrace your difference. If Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius are going through the second house, then perhaps you might think about the idea of clarifying your own values, second house, being confident enough to independently craft your own values despite whatever else people think. So breaking free from the hold of values that aren't really your own. If Jupiter and Saturn are going through house 3, then you might consider being confident enough to go in your own direction in terms of your ideas, what you think, to expand the bounds of ideas that are restrictive. So building a new foundation for your thinking that goes beyond the bounds of the ideas that you were perhaps taught. If Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius are transiting the fourth house, then you might think about where it might be necessary to cultivate independence and freedom from some of the restrictive imprints from your past, your family, the need to build an inner foundation of strength, which is tied to your ability to differentiate what is right for you personally versus what might have been imposed from your family, for example. If Jupiter and Saturn are going through the fifth, then you might think about the need to just be yourself without apology, to move beyond the restrictions that hold you back from authentically expressing your own nature, building a foundation for your self-expression and creativity that is tied up with your willingness to embrace where you're different or where you depart from the status quo. If they are going through house 6, Jupiter, Saturn in Aquarius, you might think about, well, where might I need to free myself from routines that have become restrictive? Where might I need to bring my everyday life, my work, my habits more in line with the values I hold as an independent, autonomous individual? If Jupiter and Saturn are going through house 7, you might think about, well, where might I need to bring my approach to relationships more in line with my own values? Where might I need to expand or move beyond associations that are confining or otherwise restrictive? How would moving beyond certain associations support my true self-expression? Can I now build new relationships that are based on the true values I have and not the ones I was told I should have? If Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius are going through your 8th house, we may have some deep psychic work taking place, which is designed to free you from or have you move beyond old emotional patterns and debris. So freedom from unconscious patterns and compulsions and wounds, which liberate you to be who you really are. So emancipating the self from the hold of some of these patterns. If Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius are going through house 9, you might think about expanding your belief systems to embrace more of what is outside the bounds of established belief systems. So lessons may come from cultivating a willingness to clarify what you believe, even if that departs in many ways from consensus beliefs around you. So throwing off the constraints of limiting beliefs and building a new foundation for your worldview. If Jupiter and Saturn are going through the 10th house, then you might consider how you may need to break free from the limiting impositions that say, well, this is how you need to be in the world. Having the courage to be independent in terms of the roles you play in the world. So people in my life think I should do X or Y or Z, but I really want to follow my own path in the world, breaking free from constraints which say that this is what I have to do or be in order to be accepted in the world. So relying more on your own independent values. If Jupiter and Saturn are going through the 11th house, then you might think about breaking free from the limiting constraints of certain social loyalties. So having the courage to go your own independent route, even if it departs from what the group may think. So I'm supposed to be a member of this or that political party, but when I scrutinize my own independent values, they don't really fit with the values of the party. So breaking free from certain group identities and values where they do not fit who you are. So building a new foundation for your affiliations. If Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius are going through the 12th house, then this would support clarifying your own independent spiritual values and approaches to connecting with whatever higher power you conceive of. So cultivating your own independent ways of establishing a relationship with the spiritual dimension of your life. So breaking free from the prescriptions. Going beyond the bounds in terms of exploring sources of spiritual sustenance that suit you as an individual. Now, of course, the caveat is that we really would have to understand the individual chart and individual life context to make specific pronouncements about what these transits might mean for any one person. So these are just a few guidelines, a few things to consider or think about. All right, so we've taken a sweeping look at the collective implications of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, their conjunction and the beginning of a new 20-year cycle between the two planets. And we've also tried to clarify some of the personal approaches that we may need to take as we embrace an Aquarian orientation to life and to certain parts of our lives. So how do we individually and collectively tap into the higher attributes of Aquarius to enhance and augment our human experience? Things to consider. And if you have significant parts of your chart being stimulated by Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, we wish you the very best in rising to the occasion and creatively responding to what's being asked of you. And to those who are so minded, perhaps you take a moment and send your blessings out to the masses of people across the world. And you hold a higher vision for humanity as we navigate a new phase of our collective journey, which comes with its own difficulties and challenges. Alright, so reminding you as usual that I'm available for private astrological counseling and teaching consultations, and links to that are in the description box below the video, where you'll also find links to join my email list if you'd like these sorts of videos and podcasts to be sent to you directly. And you'll also find links to audio resources and files, including my most requested aspects class. So until next time, folks, talk soon. Bye.